Most people know the man who had a dream, the preacher who stood tall at the steps of the Lincoln Memorial and spoke to the soul of a nation, the peaceful protester who walked into the jaws of hatred, facing fire hoses, snarling dogs, and billy clubs, with nothing in his hands but conviction. That image is iconic. It's powerful, and it's true, but it's not the whole story. Behind the dream was a man with doubts, a man who wrestled with fear, who struggled with strategy, who questioned whether the movement he was leading could survive the forces working to tear it apart. This is a story not often told in classrooms. You won't find it in quotes carved on monuments or in the neatly packaged speeches we hear every January. Because this story is messy. It's human. It's real. It's a story of backroom arguments and sleepless nights, of FBI surveillance and betrayal, of alliances built and broken, of a man who was loved by millions but felt profoundly alone. Martin Luther King Jr. was not a saint. He was not a statue. He was a strategist, a radical, a husband, a father, a target. He lived with constant danger and carried the weight of a movement on his shoulders. This is the Martin Luther King Jr. you didn't grow up learning about, the version history often skips over. This is the untold story. Martin Luther King Jr. was born on January 15, 1929, in a modest two-story home on Auburn Avenue in Atlanta, Georgia, a neighborhood often called Sweet Auburn, known as one of the wealthiest black communities in the United States at the time. His name wasn't always Martin. He was born Michael King Jr., but in 1934, after a trip to Germany where his father was deeply moved by the story of Protestant reformer Martin Luther, Michael King Sr. changed both his name and his son's. It was more than symbolic. It was a declaration of faith, of mission, of destiny. ML, as the family called him, was the middle child of Michael and Alberta King. His father, later known as Daddy King, was a respected preacher at Ebenezer Baptist Church, a powerful voice in the black community, known for his booming sermons and unshakable confidence. His mother, Alberta, came from a family of strong women and educators. She taught music, played the organ at church, and kept a quiet but commanding presence in the home. Their house was filled with the sound of gospel, the scent of home cooking, and the rhythm of Southern black life during the Jim Crow era. But outside those walls, the world was a different story. Martin grew up in a society rigidly divided by race. Signs marked whites only on drinking fountains, buses, and restrooms. Black citizens lived under constant reminders of second-class status, backed not only by custom, but by law. Still, within his early childhood, Martin didn't fully grasp the weight of that reality. At first, life was ordinary. School, play, church. He played baseball, rode his bike, and spent long hours reading. He loved singing hymns and reciting verses from the Bible, and his mother encouraged both. But the illusion of normalcy shattered when he was just 6 years old. Two white boys who had been his friends, playmates since infancy, suddenly stopped speaking to him. Their parents had forbidden them from associating with a black child. Martin was confused, hurt. When he told his mother, Alberta gently explained what racism was. She didn't sugarcoat it. She told him that this was a way of the world, but that he should never feel less than anyone. She reminded him that he was a child of God. Martin later said that this was the first time he felt the ugly force of racism and the bitterness of injustice. It planted a seed that would stay with him for the rest of his life. At Ebenezer, Martin watched his father command the pulpit with fire and authority. Daddy King didn't just preach on Sundays. He was a community leader who stood up to injustice directly. One story that stuck with young Martin happened in a shoe store. The clerk told the King family they would have to sit in the back. Daddy King took his son's hand and walked out instead. "I don't care how long I live in this system," he said. "I will never accept it." This was the world Martin was raised in, one where dignity was defended every day, sometimes in small acts of resistance, sometimes in bold ones, but always with pride. Martin's early education was shaped by exceptional black teachers who nurtured his growing intellect. He was sharp, curious, and loved language from the start. His favorite subjects were history and English. Even before he hit his teens, it was clear he had a gift for words. At home, he read books far above his grade level. He was especially drawn to stories of justice, ancient philosophy, and theology. In 1944, at just 15 years old, Martin skipped 9th and 12th grade and enrolled at Morehouse College, a remarkable achievement for someone so young. Morehouse was one of the most prestigious historically black colleges in the country, and it opened Martin's eyes to the wider world. At Morehouse, he encountered Dr. Benjamin Mays, the college president and a towering moral figure who became a mentor. Mays spoke of a Christianity that didn't just save souls but confronted injustice. Under Mays' guidance, Martin began to understand that faith was not only personal, it was political. Despite being a preacher's son, Martin didn't initially plan to follow in his father's footsteps. He was skeptical of emotionalism in the church. He questioned whether organized religion could truly make a difference in the real world. These weren't just adolescent doubts. They were the stirrings of a deeper, more serious philosophical struggle. And yet, he couldn't escape the pull of the pulpit. Public speaking came naturally to him. He had a calm but powerful voice and a quiet authority that could hold a room. By the time he gave his first trial sermon at Ebenezer, people were already whispering that he was destined to lead. He was just 17 when he was licensed to preach. But he wasn't ready to stop learning. After Morehouse, Martin would go on to study theology at Crozer Seminary and later earn his Ph.D. at Boston University. But even in these early years, the foundation was already being laid. He was learning how to think, how to challenge, how to speak. The man who would one day stir millions with his words was already beginning to understand their power, not just to inspire, but to move mountains. Martin Luther King Jr. was born into a world of contradiction, a country that proclaimed freedom but practiced segregation, a church that preached love but often stood silent in the face of injustice. He came from a long line of preachers, yes, but he would become something different. He would become a new kind of prophet, and this is where the journey begins. When he graduated from Morehouse in 1948 at the age of 19, he set his sights on Crozer Theological Seminary, just outside of Philadelphia. Crozer was mostly white, and for the first time, Martin found himself in a predominantly white academic environment. There were only a few black students in the seminary, and racism followed him north, not in burning crosses, but in cold silences and subtle slights. Still, Martin thrived. He ranked among the top students. He was elected president of his class. And while his classmates were reading fulfilled assignments, Martin was digging deeper into Gandhi's nonviolence, into the writings of Reinhold Niebuhr, into the concept of agape, the Greek word for selfless, sacrificial love. He was shaping his theology not just around salvation, but around justice. One professor called him one of those rare students who possessed both brilliance and compassion. He had the ability to cut through complex theories and get to the moral heart of an issue. And yet, there were contradictions. Martin was brilliant, yes, but also human. He once told a friend he felt deeply lonely at Crozer. He longed for home, for connection, for something to anchor him. That something came in the form of a young woman from Alabama, Coretta Scott. They met in Boston in 1952 while Martin was earning his doctorate at Boston University. She was a music student at the New England Conservatory. Talented, graceful, fiercely intelligent, and just as committed to social change as he was. Their courtship was fast. Letters turned into long conversations. Conversations turned into late-night walks. And soon, Martin told his mother that he had found the woman he wanted to marry. Coretta would become more than his wife. She would be his partner in the struggle, his moral compass, and, after his death, his most powerful protector. Back in Boston, Martin buried himself in his studies. He was working on his dissertation and grappling with questions that had no easy answers. Why do people suffer? Can love stand against violence? And if God is just, why does injustice persist? He did not only study theology. He studied systems, economics, psychology, sociology. He wanted to understand oppression, spiritually and structurally. By 1955, he had completed his Ph.D. in systematic theology. He was just 26 years old. He could have stayed in the North, taken a comfortable academic post, lived quietly, taught theology, and raised a family away from the heat of the South. Martin couldn't shake the call. Something deep inside kept pulling him back to the black churches, back to the segregated buses, back to the South. He once wrote, "The church must be reminded that it is not the master or the servant of the state, but the conscience of the state." He knew now what kind of preacher he would be. In 1954, he accepted the call to lead Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. He was only 25, newly married, fresh out of graduate school, unknown to the wider world. He had a sharp mind, a steady voice, and a heart on fire. He didn't know it yet. However, the very next year, a tired woman would refuse to give up her seat on a city bus, and history would come knocking. Montgomery, Alabama, 1954. Martin Luther King Jr. arrives in town with 2 suitcases, a wife, a degree, and a calling. He's 25, fresh-faced, still learning the rhythms of his own voice. He takes the pulpit at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, a modest red brick chapel just a stone's throw from the Alabama state capitol. It's a proud congregation, well-educated, dignified, middle class. They want a preacher who can inspire and represent them, and they find one. King brings something new. He's not the fire and brimstone type. His sermons are thoughtful, structured, philosophical. He quotes the Bible, yes, but also Socrates, Gandhi, and Reinhold Niebuhr. He challenges people not just to believe, but to act. Outside the church walls, Montgomery is a city defined by rules, Jim Crow rules. Black citizens make up over half the population, yet they're forced to sit at the back of buses, if they're allowed to sit at all. They pay the same fare as whites, sometimes more, yet can be forced to stand while white seats remain empty. It's humiliating, it's daily, and it's everywhere. However, something is shifting in the air. A seamstress named Rosa Parks, trained in civil disobedience, sits down on a bus and refuses to give up her seat to a white man. She's arrested. It's December 1st, 1955. Within hours, word spreads across Montgomery. The black community is outraged. Leaders in churches, civic groups, and the Montgomery NAACP spring into action. They need a movement. They need discipline. And they need a voice, not a radical, not someone already branded by the white press. Someone fresh, someone respectable, someone with a preacher's cadence and a scholar's mind. They turn to Martin Luther King Jr. He's hesitant. He's only been in town a year. He's young, unproven, unready, or so he thinks. But in the meeting that forms the Montgomery Improvement Association, he is nominated on the spot to be president. He accepts, and just like that, the spotlight finds him. The Montgomery Bus Boycott begins on December 5th, 1955. Tens of thousands of black residents refuse to ride the buses. They walk to work. They carpool. They endure rain, cold, and blistering heat. But they don't give in. For the first time, economic pressure becomes a weapon in the struggle for civil rights. And King? He becomes the face of it. His speeches echo through churches and homes like thunder. He speaks of justice, but also love, of resistance, but never hatred, of nonviolence, not as weakness, but as moral power. The press takes notice. The cameras show up. And Martin Luther King Jr., the young preacher with no political experience, is suddenly on the front page of newspapers around the world. But leadership comes with a price. On January 30th, 1956, while King is at a boycott meeting, someone throws a bomb onto the front porch of his home. His wife, Coretta, and their baby daughter, Yolanda, are inside. The blast shatters windows. Smoke fills the rooms. Regardless, they survive. King races home to find a crowd of angry supporters gathered outside, some armed, ready to retaliate. He raises his hand. He tells them to go home, to put down their weapons. That love is stronger than hate, that the movement must remain nonviolent, or it will lose its soul. It's a turning point. From that night forward, King knows there is no turning back. He is not just leading a boycott. He is leading a revolution of conscience. But the pressure doesn't let up. King is arrested, harassed, threatened constantly. The FBI begins to monitor him. He's called a communist, a troublemaker, a threat to the Southern way of life. And yet, he stands firm. The boycott stretches on weeks, then months. Through summer heat and winter cold, the black citizens of Montgomery keep walking for 381 days. Until finally, on November 13, 1956, the U.S. Supreme Court rules that bus segregation is unconstitutional. Victory. The boycott ends. King returns to the bus, not to dominate, but to ride as an equal. It's a moment of triumph, and also a warning. Power doesn't give up quietly. As the boycott ends, hate groups ramp up attacks. Black churches are bombed. Homes are vandalized. The backlash is real and only just beginning, but the message is clear. Nonviolence works. Organization works. Courage works. And Martin Luther King Jr., once a quiet seminary student unsure of his path, is now a national figure. He didn't seek fame. He didn't ask for the burden. It found him, and he chose to carry it. Not for glory, not for headlines, but because the cause was just, and the time had come. Montgomery changed everything. The bus boycott wasn't just a local victory. It was a signal that the tides were shifting, that organized, peaceful resistance could work. Even in the Deep South, across the country, people paid attention, and so did the movement. In 1957, just weeks after the Supreme Court upheld the end of bus segregation, Martin Luther King Jr. helped found something new, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC. It wasn't a political party. It wasn't tied to one church or one city. It was a network of pastors, congregations, and communities working together to push for civil rights, grounded in faith and moral authority. King became its first president. His role now stretched beyond Montgomery. He began traveling constantly, preaching, organizing, meeting with local leaders, building alliances. He wasn't just a pastor anymore. He was becoming a national strategist. Still, the SCLC faced challenges from the start. How do you lead a movement across a region designed to silence it? The South in the late 1950s was still deeply segregated. Laws, customs, unwritten rules, all used to maintain a racial order generations old. And in many places, police, judges, and even governors defended it with everything they had. Yet protests were growing. Sit-ins, marches, student movements. Young people especially were rising to the front lines. King saw this with both hope and caution. He believed in direct action, but he also believed in discipline. Every protest had to be well-planned, tightly organized, and rooted in nonviolence. He was a tactician as much as a preacher, and he knew they needed allies. So he took the message to new places: Washington, New York, Chicago, Los Angeles. He gave speeches not only in churches, but in union halls, universities' auditoriums. He met with black leaders, white liberals, business owners, even the vice president. The movement couldn't win without national attention. And King understood media like few others. He knew how images of dignified protests met with brutality could turn public opinion. And slowly, the needle began to move. In 1958, his first book, Stride Toward Freedom, was published. It was a memoir of the Montgomery boycott, but more than that, it was a blueprint, a clear articulation of the philosophy behind nonviolent resistance. The same year, while signing copies of that book in Harlem, a woman approached him in a department store. She asked if he was Martin Luther King. He smiled and said yes. She plunged a 7-inch steel letter opener into his chest. It came within a fraction of his aorta. Doctors later said if he had sneezed, he would have died. He didn't. He recovered in a New York hospital bed, reflecting on how violence had almost ended his life, not on the front lines of a protest, but in a quiet bookstore. When asked later what he felt toward the woman who stabbed him, King said, "I have no malice. I feel no anger. I pray for her." His voice began to change. There was new weight in it. Not just hope, but weariness. Not just conviction, but cost. By 1960, King moved his family to Atlanta, closer to the heart of the movement and to his roots. He resumed co-pastoring at Ebenezer Baptist Church with his father. It was a homecoming, but also a new chapter. The fight was no longer just about buses. It was about lunch counters, schools, voting booths, juries, jobs, justice. Across the South, college students began launching sit-ins, bold, nonviolent occupations of whites-only diners and businesses. They dressed in suits and ties, sat in silence, and endured slurs, beatings, arrests. King supported them fully. He praised their courage. He joined them, getting arrested for the first time in Atlanta after refusing to leave a department store lunch counter. This was a turning point for public perception. No longer just minister or author, King was now being treated like a criminal for the simple act of sitting down. National leaders began to take clearer sides. During the 1960 presidential campaign, one candidate, John F. Kennedy, made a quiet phone call to Coretta while King was in jail. A small gesture, but it rippled across black communities. Many credit that call with helping Kennedy win the presidency. Martin noticed the movement was no longer at the edges of American life. It was becoming a force no candidate could ignore. By the end of the decade, the civil rights movement was gaining momentum like never before. The SCLC had chapters in multiple states. Protests were spreading. National media coverage was increasing. Yet so was resistance from Southern governments, police departments, and white supremacist groups. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover authorized a campaign to surveil King, tapping his phones and monitoring his movements under the codename COINTELPRO. King knew he kept going anyway. He believed the moral arc of the universe bent toward justice. And now, for the first time, that arc was beginning to bend in public view. Birmingham, Alabama, a name that, by 1963, stood for something far beyond steel and smoke. It was the most segregated city in the South, a place where racism didn't whisper, it shouted, where the local police commissioner, Eugene Bull Connor, wielded fire hoses like weapons and snarling dogs like soldiers. For King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, this was a place, the testing ground. If a wound this deep could be touched, maybe the entire country would finally feel it. They called the plan Project C. C for confrontation. This wasn't chaos. It was choreography. Marches, sit-ins, kneel-ins, every move deliberate, every step taken with prayer. Children were trained in nonviolence as if it were a sacred ritual. King arrived in Birmingham prepared. He carried no weapons, no armor, only determination. Then the arrests began. Dozens, hundreds. Each day brought more bodies behind bars. And then came the moment he knew would matter. He stepped into the street, led a march, and was thrown into a jail cell. There, in the dim silence of the Birmingham jail, King received a newspaper. Inside, an open letter. 8 white clergymen, urging patience, criticizing the demonstrations as unwise and untimely. King picked up a pen. No speeches, no crowd, just paper, ink, and the fire in his chest. I am in Birmingham because injustice is here, he wrote. The letter spilled out in the margins of smuggled scraps. He spoke of broken promises, of brutality dressed in legal robes, of a dream deferred for centuries while children buried their innocence too early. Justice too long delayed is justice denied. It wasn't a reply. It was scripture for a new generation. Words forged in a jail cell became one of the most powerful documents of the civil rights era. Then came the children, thousands of them, teenagers, grade schoolers, some barely tall enough to see over the police barricades. They filled the streets with tiny feet and enormous courage. Connor responded with fury. He turned Birmingham into a battlefield. Hoses roared like cannons. Dogs snapped at arms and ankles. Officers shoved children into paddy wagons 2 at a time. The images exploded across America. Families in Chicago, students in New York, clergy in San Francisco. Suddenly they could see it. This wasn't a theory. It wasn't just a Southern issue. It was real, raw, unforgivable. Pressure built. President Kennedy took notice. Birmingham business leaders, once defiant, grew uneasy. The cost of standing still had become too high. And then something shifted. Agreements were made. Segregation signs came down. Downtown stores opened their doors to all. A victory, yes, though fragile. Behind closed doors, anger simmered. And days later, vengeance struck. September 15th, 1963. The 16th Street Baptist Church. For girls dressed for Sunday service. Bows in their hair. Smiles wide as heaven. At 10:22 a.m., a bomb detonated beneath the church steps. Bricks shattered. Stained glass rained down. The girls, Addie Mae Collins, Denise McNair, Carol Robertson, Cynthia Wesley, never walked back outside. The city mourned. King stood at the funeral, holding his own tears behind his teeth. He spoke of hope, of faith, of love's enduring power. Though inside his heart split open, the violence was no longer aimed at leaders or activists. Now it reached for children. And still, somehow, the movement pressed on. A few weeks later, on August 28, 1963, they gathered in the Capitol. A sea of faces, black, white, young, old, nearly 250,000 strong. They came for jobs. They came for freedom. They came because something sacred was unfolding before their eyes. The March on Washington wasn't meant to be a coronation. It was a demand. And yet, on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, a voice rose above all others. King stood before the nation and spoke of a dream planted deep in the soil of American promise, where sons of former slaves and sons of former slave owners would sit together at the table of brotherhood, where justice would roll down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. It wasn't just a speech. It was prophecy, carved not in stone but in memory, echoing in every corner of the country, from school hallways to kitchen radios. Yet King knew this moment, this glorious, sunlit moment, was only a chapter. Birmingham had cracked something open, and while the light was finally shining in, shadows still waited. Because the dream was never meant to live in speeches. It had to survive in streets, in laws, in lives. That would require more than marches. It would take sacrifice, and the storm ahead was darker than anyone could imagine. The crowd had dispersed. The dream echoed across airwaves and living rooms, carved into history by a voice that refused to waver. Yet as the applause faded, so did the illusion of triumph. King understood. One speech, no matter how powerful, couldn't dismantle a system centuries deep. Change, real change, would have to be written into the law. So he moved, tirelessly, from pulpit to podium, courtroom to Capitol Hill. He met with senators. He pressed the president. He filled auditoriums and flooded the pages of newspapers, always with one aim: civil rights written into the American conscience and into its code. Lyndon B. Johnson, now in the White House, saw what had become impossible to ignore. The nation stood at a crossroads. One path led backward, towards silence. The other demanded courage. And in July of 1964, after months of pressure, deal-making, and relentless public demand, the Civil Rights Act became law. Segregation in public places struck down. Discrimination in employment now illegal. King stood beside the president, pen in hand, a half-smile hiding years of exhaustion. Victory, yes, though only halfway up the mountain, because in the South, a more silent barrier remained, one that couldn't be knocked down with speeches or headlines. The vote. Across Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, black citizens face a maze of poll taxes, literacy tests, and intimidation. Paper laws existed, but in practice, the ballot box remained closed. And so King turned his attention to the right he believed could unlock all others. Selma, a small town with deep resistance and deeper courage. Here, the movement narrowed its focus. Marches were planned, registration drives launched. One by one, citizens stood in line, quiet, orderly, waiting to claim a birthright long denied. The response came fast. Sheriff Jim Clark's deputies struck marchers in plain view. John Lewis, still a young man, fell beneath a rain of clubs. Local organizers were jailed, harassed, beaten in front of their children. And then a single moment broke through the national fog. March 7, 1965. Sunday, they walked toward the bridge, 600 strong. They carried no weapons. Their hands held only faith. On the far side, State troopers lined up shoulder to shoulder, gas masks on, clubs raised. Without warning, they charged. Tear gas choked the air. Hooves trampled bodies. Nightsticks cracked against skulls and spines. Television cameras captured every second. Across the country, families stared at their screens in disbelief. This was no foreign war. This was America. This was what peaceful resistance looked like. When met with fear, the day became known as Bloody Sunday. King prepared to lead another march. Yet, this time, thousands gathered with him. Clergy, students, factory workers, black and white, stood side by side, ready to walk the road together. At the bridge, he paused, kneeled, prayed, then turned back. Some were confused, others disappointed. He had chosen restraint over confrontation, because this time they marched for attention and legislation. Soon after, a federal court gave clearance, and on March 21st, 1965, King and thousands more crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge, peacefully, lawfully, triumphantly. 5 days later, they reached Montgomery, a sea of humanity, stretching from the riverbanks to the governor's mansion. The ground trembled beneath their steps. And King stood once more before a crowd, voice weathered but unwavering. How long? Not long, because the arc of the moral universe is long, and it bends toward justice. By August, President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It outlawed the barriers that had locked millions out of democracy. For the first time in generations, the ballot would belong to every citizen. King had climbed another summit. The dream seemed closer now, etched in hearts and in law. Yet even in that glow, shadows gathered. Some in the movement began to question his approach. Younger voices spoke louder. Cities in the North burned with anger far more explosive than anything seen in the South. King had marched through Alabama, but what could he offer Harlem? Or Watts? Or Detroit? The next battle would reach into places untouched by federal law, into poverty, housing, war, and a nation's conscience. The movement was changing, and so was its leader. The laws had changed. Signs came down. Ballots opened up. Yet across America's cities, a deeper pain refused to heal. Martin Luther King Jr. stepped off Southern soil and onto a different kind of battlefield. Northern streets didn't greet him with fire hoses or snarling dogs. Instead, they gave him something colder: indifference. Chicago, 1966. The city he called the most segregated in America. He moved his family into a slum apartment on the west side. No heat, rats in the walls, garbage stacked up in alleys where children played. This was where poverty and racism merged, far from the TV cameras that had once followed his every move. King marched through white neighborhoods. Brick by brick, bottle by bottle, the hatred showed its face again. One rock struck his head. He staggered, steadied himself. Later, he said he hadn't seen that kind of hatred, not even in Mississippi, because this wasn't the South. This was the North, the land many thought of as better, yet the lines between black and white, rich and poor, were etched just as deep. He shifted focus, called for fair housing, demanded an economic bill of rights, jobs, health care, dignity. He spoke of a new kind of revolution, one that attacked poverty at its roots. And not everyone agreed. The media turned colder. Donors hesitated. Even within the movement, cracks formed. Younger activists, rising fast, questioned his message of nonviolence. They spoke of power, black power. No more begging for seats at the table. They wanted their own. Malcolm X had already shifted the tone. Now, after his assassination, a younger generation carried that fire forward, angrier, bolder, less patient. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee moved on without him. Stokely Carmichael marched in Mississippi with King, then took the microphone and called for power, not peace. Crowds roared. The message had changed. The center of gravity was shifting. And King, still young, still filled with purpose, stood at a crossroads. He faced pressure from all sides. The government labeled him a problem. The FBI watched him around the clock. Whispers followed him. Surveillance tapes. Innuendos. A slow attempt to ruin his name before the public ever saw the truth. Edgar Hoover called him the most dangerous Negro in America. They didn't fear his marches. They feared his influence. Then came the war. Vietnam was swallowing lives. Thousands of young men sent overseas. Bodies returned in boxes, many of them black. King could no longer stay silent. At Riverside Church in 1967, he rose to speak not just about race, but about empire. He called America the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. Some gasped, others applauded. The White House turned its back. Even civil rights allies looked away. The press sharpened their knives. Newspapers that once printed his dream now questioned his loyalty. They asked him why he would risk everything. His answer was clear. Silence, in the face of injustice, was no longer an option. He saw the connection between war abroad and suffering at home, between the bombs dropped in Southeast Asia and the broken schools in Harlem, between the money spent on tanks and the families without food. He had grown beyond the dream on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. This was a different King now. He began organizing the Poor People's Campaign, a movement to bring the poor, black, white, Latino, indigenous, to the doorstep of Washington. They would camp on the National Mall, demand jobs, fair wages, a guaranteed income. They would bring the truth of America's forgotten to the nation's front lawn. His advisors warned him. Too ambitious, too many enemies, too many threads pulled at once. But the vision had widened, and the stakes had never felt more urgent. In early 1968, he traveled to Memphis. Garbage workers had gone on strike. 2 black men had died, crushed in faulty trucks while hiding from a storm. Their lives had been treated as disposable. King came to stand with them, not for cameras, not for headlines. He came because their fight was the same as his. Dignity, recognition, to be seen as men, not machines. On April 3rd, he stood before a congregation. Rain pounded the roof. Thunder shook the stained glass. His voice carried through the sanctuary like prophecy. "I've seen the promised land," he said. "I may not get there with you, but we as a people will get the promised land." Some say he knew. There was a gravity in his tone, a weariness that felt like farewell. The next evening, as the sun dipped behind the Lorraine Motel, a shot cracked through the warm Tennessee air, and the dreamer fell. Martin Luther King Jr. was no longer just a civil rights leader. He was pushing the boundaries of his mission. The fight had expanded. It wasn't only about segregation or voting rights anymore. He was speaking out against poverty, against war, against a system that kept millions trapped at the bottom, and not everyone liked the direction. Critics inside the movement said he was spreading himself too thin. Donors pulled back. Support was fading. Even close allies worried he was taking on too much. Still, King pressed forward. Memphis was tense. A previous march there had turned violent, a first for any King-led event. The pressure to prove his message of nonviolence still held power was immense. On the night of April 3rd, a thunderstorm swept through the city. King hadn't planned to speak. He was exhausted, but the crowd was waiting, and they needed to hear from him. He stood at the pulpit of Mason Temple and delivered what would become his final speech. He spoke of the movement, of sacrifice, of fear, and toward the end, his voice changed, calm, firm, almost prophetic. "I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to promised land." Some in the room felt a chill. Others just heard the same fire he always brought. The next day, King moved to the motel as usual. Meetings, phone calls, a few laughs with his team. Dinner plans were being made. He stepped out onto the balcony to speak with colleagues below. At 6:01 p.m., a single shot cracked the air. King dropped instantly. Friends rushed to him, shouting for help. There was no second shot, no warning, just silence and then chaos. King was taken to St. Joseph's Hospital. He was pronounced dead just after 7 p.m. He was 39. Within hours, cities across America began to boil. Washington, D.C., Chicago, Baltimore, fires broke out. Anger spilled into the streets. For some, It felt like the last voice for peace had been silenced. The man who urged restraint was gone. That evening, Robert Kennedy delivered the news to a crowd in Indianapolis. He spoke from the back of a flatbed truck. No notes, no script. He reminded them of his own brother's death. He spoke of justice, compassion, unity. Indianapolis stayed calm. It was one of the few cities that did. The next morning, Coretta Scott King arrived in Memphis. There were no public tears, only purpose. She flew home with her husband's body. Atlanta waited to receive its son. On April 9th, tens of thousands filled the streets of Atlanta. They followed a humble wooden wagon pulled by mules, carrying King's casket. It was a final procession for a man who had walked miles for others. Inside Ebenezer Baptist Church, Mahalia Jackson sang his favorite hymn. Outside, people lined the streets in silence. Even in grief, the movement pressed on. Coretta led a march in Memphis just days after the funeral. She stepped into her husband's role, strong, composed. The Poor People's Campaign moved forward. By May, thousands gathered in Washington and built a camp they called Resurrection City. They lived in tents on the National Mall, demanding economic justice. Rain came. Mud followed. The protests were on for weeks, then was dismantled. Still, the message was planted. 2 months later, a man named James Earl Ray was arrested in London. He confessed to the killing, then took it back. Questions began to swirl. Had he acted alone? Had someone else pulled the strings? The official answer never changed. Ray was convicted. He died in prison decades later. In the years that followed, King's image grew larger than life. A holiday was eventually created in his name. Schools, streets, libraries bore it. But for those who would walk beside him, the memory was never simple. He had been more than the dream, more than the speeches. He had been a man, flawed, determined, unshakable. He had warned that America's soul was still at risk, and his warning didn't die on that balcony. His voice was silenced. His message was not. The man arrested for killing Martin Luther King Jr. was a drifter, a petty criminal, a fugitive, James Earl Ray, captured in London, carrying a false passport under the name Ramon George Sneyd. He had been on the run for over 2 months. Authorities said the evidence was clear. Ray had rented the room across from the Lorraine Motel. He had purchased a rifle in Memphis. Fingerprints matched. The murder weapon was found near the scene. In 1969, Ray pleaded guilty in exchange for avoiding the death penalty, sentenced to 99 years in prison. No trial, no testimony, just silence. 3 days later, he changed his story. Ray claimed he'd been set up. He said someone named Raoul had manipulated him. He started writing letters, requesting a trial, pointing to a conspiracy. Most dismissed it as a lie. Others weren't so sure. Years passed. Questions deepened. Why had there been no trial? Why had the FBI followed King for years, even in his final days? Why did the government try to discredit him in life and claim to honor him in death? Some saw inconsistencies in the official timeline. Witnesses gave conflicting statements. Others wondered how a small-time crook pulled off such a precise assassination. Alone, the case remained officially closed. The doubt never did. While conspiracy theories circled, Coretta Scott King transformed grief into purpose. She became a voice of steady leadership, dignified, resolute. She spoke out for peace, justice, women's rights, led marches, met world leaders, founded the Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Nonviolent Social Change in Atlanta. Her mission was clear: preserve his legacy and push it forward. The movement itself fractured in the years after King's death. Without his moral compass, unity splintered. Younger activists leaned toward militancy. Older leaders struggled to hold coalitions together. The Vietnam War raged on. Poverty deepened. Hope, for many, felt further away than ever. And still his words endured. In 1983, after years of protests and political resistance, President Ronald Reagan signed legislation creating Martin Luther King Jr. Day. It didn't come easily. Opponents questioned his legacy, his methods, even his patriotism. Some lawmakers refused to support a holiday in his name. They called him divisive, said he didn't deserve it. Stevie Wonder led a national campaign. Millions signed petitions. Coretta stood firm in Washington. The holiday was signed into law, but it would take another 17 years for all 50 states to observe it. In a twist that shocked many, the King family eventually joined the call for a new investigation. They met with James Earl Ray. They said they didn't believe he acted alone, if he pulled the trigger at all. In 1999, a Memphis civil jury ruled that King's assassination had been the result of conspiracy, one involving government agencies and organized crime. The U.S. Department of Justice disagreed, calling the evidence inconclusive. Still, the ruling added fuel to a fire that never quite went out. By the 1990s, King had become more than a man. He was an idea, taught in schools, quoted by presidents, carved into stone. Yet for many who had marched beside him, something was missing in the retelling. He wasn't just a dreamer. He had been a disruptor. He had challenged economic power, foreign wars, the silence of white moderates. He had warned that the struggle ahead would be harder than the one behind. Coretta never stopped. Through tragedy and triumph, she carried his vision forward. She once said, "Struggle is a never-ending process. Freedom is never really won. You earn it and win it in every generation." In November 2008, America made history. A nation once built on slavery elected its first black president. Barack Obama took the stage in Chicago. The crowd erupted, tears streaming, hope rising. Some called it fulfillment of Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream. And yet, for many who had walked through fire in the 1960s, the moment felt more complex. The dream King preached wasn't just about political power. It was about economic justice, ending poverty, eradicating war, dismantling systems that favored the few. A black man in the White House didn't erase those struggles. It couldn't. Then came the unrest. In 2014, the streets of Ferguson lit up. Michael Brown, unarmed, 18 years old, was shot and killed by police. His body lay in the street for hours. The anger spread city by city. Hands up, don't shoot. A new movement was born. Black Lives Matter. Young activists flooded the streets, carrying signs with King's face beside new names: Tamir Rice, Sandra Bland, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd. They invoked King's legacy while challenging the way it had been sanitized. Across America, King's face adorned classrooms, coffee mugs, postage stamps. He had become a symbol of unity, peace, harmony. Yet in his time, he was labeled an extremist, spied on by the FBI, vilified by politicians, murdered while standing with striking workers. In 2011, a massive stone memorial to Martin Luther King Jr. was unveiled in Washington, D.C., 30 feet tall, his gaze cast across the National Mall. Etched into the granite, words from his most famous speeches, lines about hope, about love, about peace. Some noticed what was missing: no quotes about poverty, no mention of militarism, no reference to his call for a radical redistribution of power. Coretta Scott King passed in 2006. She had spent nearly 4 decades shaping the way the world would remember him. Their children, Yolanda, Martin III, Dexter, Bernice, each carried pieces of that torch, though not always together. Even within the King family, debates stirred about how to preserve the legacy and how to tell the truth. In 2020, after the murder of George Floyd, the world erupted again. Tens of millions marched across continents. People carried King's image, yet demanded deeper change. This wasn't just about reform. It was about reckoning. The dream was back on the streets. And it looked different now. Fierce, diverse, global. To a new generation, Martin Luther King Jr. isn't a saint in a suit. He's a blueprint. Proof that pressure can change history. That movements aren't born in speeches. They're built in struggle. They've read the letter from the Birmingham jail. They've studied his later years, when he spoke of economic exploitation, systemic injustice, the silence of white moderates. Every January, Americans pause to honor his legacy. Schools close. Ceremonies unfold. But the question lingers. What would he say today? Would he smile at the progress? or challenge the comfort of those who claim his name. Martin Luther King Jr. didn't just give America a dream. He gave a mirror. He showed a nation what it could be, then held it accountable when it failed to get there. That mirror still stands. Cracked, maybe, but unbroken. The dream never belonged to one man. It belongs to each generation that dares to reach for it again. This was Martin Luther King Jr., the untold story of MLK. The man, the movement, the message still unfolding.